Picture this moment. March 1943. You're Lieutenant James Howard, 23 years old, lying in the nose of a B-17 bomber at 23,000 feet over occupied France. The temperature outside is 40 degrees below zero. Your oxygen mask is frosting over with each breath. German fighters have been attacking for the past hour. You've watched 3 bombers from your formation go down in flames, 30 men dead or captured. Your crew has just spent 8 hours flying through hell to reach a ball-bearing factory near Paris. Intelligence says this factory supplies critical components for German tanks and aircraft. Destroy it, and you cripple Nazi production. Miss it, and those 30 dead men died for nothing. Your bombardier calls out over the intercom, "Bombs away!" You watch through binoculars as 12 500-pound bombs tumble away from your aircraft. You track them as they fall, spinning through 4 miles of freezing air, and you see exactly where they're going to land. Half a mile from the target, in a wheat field, completely harmless. You're not alone. Of the 228 bombers in your formation, that day, only 19 actually hit anything remotely close to their intended target. That's an 8% success rate. 8%. And honestly, that was considered a pretty good day. This was the reality of American strategic bombing in early World War II, and nobody in Washington wanted to talk about it. Back home, generals stood before Congress with confident smiles and detailed charts, explaining how precision daylight bombing would win the war. They had mathematical models, they had test results, they had a miracle device called the Norden bombsight that supposedly let you drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. But over Europe, crews were learning a brutal truth. Dropping bombs from 25,000 feet while traveling at 180 miles per hour with German fighters attacking you and explosive flak shells detonating around your aircraft made accuracy basically impossible. You weren't precision bombing. You were throwing explosives in the general direction of Germany and praying something important got hit. The human cost was staggering. Statistically, a bomber crew in 1943 had only a 1 in 4 chance of surviving their required 25 missions. Men were dying by the thousands, burning alive in shot-down bombers, bleeding out at high altitude, freezing to death as they bailed out over enemy territory. And for what? To watch their bombs disappear into clouds or crater empty fields while German factories kept running. Then came October 14th, 1943, the second raid on Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants. It would become known as Black Thursday. 60 bombers shot down, 600 men killed or captured in a single mission. A disaster by any measure. But buried in the after-action reports from that catastrophic day was something strange. One bomb group had accidentally approached their target from the wrong direction due to a navigation error, and their accuracy had been almost 4 times better than everyone else. That accident would change everything. Within 3 months, American bombardiers would be deliberately aiming away from their targets, aiming at empty fields, at rivers, at anything except what they were trying to hit, and their accuracy would triple overnight. The physics were counterintuitive. The math seemed impossible, but the results were undeniable. Sometimes the best way to hit your target is to aim somewhere else entirely and let the wind do the work for you. This is the story of offset bombing. How one navigator's mistake revealed a truth about geometry and physics that changed warfare forever. How desperate innovation born from catastrophic failure became doctrine that still guides bombing tactics. Today, 80 years later, in the age of stealth aircraft and GPS-guided weapons. Because when all your sophisticated technology fails, when your million-dollar computers stop working, sometimes you need to go back to basic physics, wind, geometry, and the courage to aim at what looks like the wrong target. The year 1943 was supposed to be when American strategic bombing proved itself. After years of preparation, after billions of dollars invested in aircraft and training, After confident promises to the American public that precision bombing would bring Germany to its knees, the 8th Air Force based in England was finally operating at full strength. Hundreds of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators filled English airfields. Each bomber carried a crew of 10 men and up to 8,000 pounds of explosives. The formations that assembled each morning were massive, sometimes 300, bombers escorted by fighters, an aerial armada that darkened the sky. The doctrine was called precision daylight bombing, and it was distinctly American. While the British RAF had switched to nighttime area bombing after suffering catastrophic losses during the day, the Americans insisted they could bomb accurately, in daylight, and destroy specific industrial targets. Factories, oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, submarine pens. These weren't just military targets. They were the industrial heart of the Nazi war machine. Destroy them precisely, and you'd strangle Germany's ability to fight without carpet-bombing entire cities. It was a noble strategy. It was morally superior to the British approach of simply burning German cities to the ground. And it was failing catastrophically. The Army Air Forces had calculated that to effectively destroy industrial targets, they needed what they called a circular error probable, CP for short, of about 1,000 feet. In plain English, this meant that half your bombs needed to land within 1,000 feet of your aiming point. That would put enough explosives inside a factory complex to cause serious damage. 1,000 feet from 4 miles up. That was the goal. It sounds reasonable, doesn't it? If you can see a factory from 25,000 feet through a sophisticated bombsight, surely you can get half your bombs within 1,000 feet of it. Except by summer 1943, the actual SEP for 8th Air Force missions was hovering around 3,200 feet, more than 3 times worse than what was needed. Some missions were much worse. During the first Schweinfurt raid in August 1943, bombers dropped 724 tons of explosives on ball-bearing factories that supplied 40% of Germany's production. These weren't small targets. The factory complexes covered dozens of acres. But post-mission reconnaissance photographs showed that less than 200 tons had actually hit inside the factory grounds. The rest had cratered residential neighborhoods, plowed fields, and destroyed a medieval church 3 miles away from the target. 60 bombers were shot down that day. 600 men killed or captured, and the ball-bearing factories were back to full production within 6 weeks. The math was brutal and simple. American bombers were dropping 3 bombs for everyone that came close to hitting anything valuable. The other 2 were destroying random pieces of France and Germany, killing civilians and accomplishing nothing strategic. Bomber crews started calling their missions the aluminum cloud approach, because that's essentially what it was. You flew. In tight formation, 300 bombers packed together in a defensive box formation. You hoped that your lead bombardier, the guy in the front bomber who everyone else would follow, knew what he was doing, and when he released his bombs, you immediately toggled yours. The theory was that even if individual bombs scattered, the sheer volume would overwhelm the target. Drop enough explosives in roughly the right area, and something important would get destroyed. It was less precision bombing and more saturation bombing with pretensions of accuracy. But German factory complexes weren't enormous. A typical synthetic oil plant might cover 40 acres. That sounds large until you realize that with a SEP of 3,000 feet, your bomb pattern was spreading across 300 acres. You were essentially carpet bombing and praying that something important existed in that 300-acre circle around your aiming point. The human cost made it worse. Every mission meant 10-man crews flying through walls of flak, those black puffs of 88mm explosive shells that could shred a bomber's aluminum skin like tissue paper. Crew survival rates were terrifying. A bomber crew in 1943 statistically had only a 1 in 4 chance of completing their required 25 missions before being killed, wounded, or captured. And for what? To watch your bombs disappear into clouds, or worse, to see them hit and No, you'd just obliterated a residential block while the factory next door kept churning out tank parts. Navigator John Morris from the 301st Bomb Group wrote in his diary after a mission to Bremen, "Counted 127 holes in our ship. Don't know how we made it home. Jenkins bled out in the waist gunner position before we crossed the channel. He was 19 years old. And I have no idea if we hit anything that mattered." Morale was collapsing faster than the bombing campaign itself. Crews were being asked to die for a strategy that obviously wasn't working, and they knew it. Every man could do the math in his head. If you had a 1 in 4 chance of survival and your bombs had maybe a 10% chance of hitting anything important, what exactly were you accomplishing? The Norden bombsight was supposed to be the solution to everything. If you've ever wondered why American bombers kept flying suicidal daylight missions while the British wisely switched to night bombing, the Norden is your answer. This device became an obsession, a talisman, a mechanical miracle that would make American air power unstoppable. Officially designated the Mark 15 Norden bombsight, it was essentially a mechanical analog computer that weighed 50 pounds and cost $8,000 per unit in 1943. That's more than most houses cost at the time. The Army Air Forces were so committed to this device that they spent $1.5 billion developing and producing it over the course of the war. To put that in perspective, the entire Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb cost $2 billion. America spent 3/4 as much money on a bombsight as it did on nuclear weapons. Carl Norden, a Swiss engineer working in New York, had designed this optical computing marvel in the 1920s with a genuinely brilliant concept. The bombardier would lie prone in the nose of the aircraft, peer through the sight's eyepiece, and manually track the target while the bombsight automatically calculated wind drift, altitude, airspeed, and bomb trajectory. The truly innovative part was that the sight was wired directly into the aircraft's autopilot system. During the final bombing run, those critical 3 minutes before bomb release, the bombardier could make tiny corrections using a control panel, and the bombsight would actually fly the airplane to compensate for wind drift and keep the aircraft lined up perfectly with the target. In theory, this gave you pickle barrel accuracy. Army Air Force's demonstrations at training bases showed bombardiers dropping practice bombs into 100-foot circles from 20,000 feet. Promotional materials literally claimed you could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 4 miles up. It became a propaganda point, repeated in newsreels and magazine articles. American ingenuity and American precision would defeat Nazi Germany. The security around Norden bombsights was absolutely paranoid. Bombardiers took a formal oath, separate from their military oath of service, never to reveal anything about the device's operation or design. Before every mission, an armed guard would bring the bombsight to the aircraft in a locked case. The bombardier would install it, use it for the mission, and then it would be removed and locked away again. If a bomber was going down, the bombardier had explicit orders to destroy the site with a thermite grenade before bailing out. Several bombardiers actually died trying to follow those orders, staying with burning aircraft too long while attempting to melt their Norden sights into slag. The military genuinely believed that if the Germans captured an intact bombsight and reverse-engineered it, America's strategic bombing advantage would evaporate overnight. Here's the crushing irony that nobody learned. Until after the war, the Germans already had the Nordens, secrets, and didn't care. A German spy named Hermann Lang had stolen complete blueprints of the Norden bombsight in 1938. He'd worked at the factory that manufactured components, and simply walked out with the plans. German intelligence forwarded them to the Luftwaffe's technical department, and German engineers studied them carefully. Then they shrugged and went back to their own Lotfernrohr 7 bombsight design. Why? Because they'd already figured out what American crews were about to learn the hard way through blood and fire. The Norden's precision was completely theoretical. It assumed conditions that never existed in actual combat. The Norden's brilliant engineering was built on assumptions that made perfect sense in a laboratory and meant nothing over Germany. It assumed you'd have unlimited time over the target to line up your bombing run. It assumed perfect visibility, Clear skies, no smoke, excellent visual conditions. It assumed stable air with predictable winds. And most critically, it assumed you wouldn't be under attack while bombing. Combat over Europe offered exactly none of those conditions. The first problem came from German defensive tactics. German factory complexes weren't sitting helplessly in open fields waiting to be bombed. Every major industrial target had smoke generators that could blanket entire zones within 5 minutes of an air raid alarm. By late 1943, German doctrine required every strategic target to have enough smoke-generating capacity to obscure visibility for at least 30 minutes. The smoke generators themselves were ingenious in their simplicity. Oil-based chemicals heated in large containers would produce thick, white smoke that rose and spread across entire industrial zones. German observers with binoculars would watch for approaching bomber formations and trigger the generators the moment aircraft were spotted. By the time bombers reached their final bombing run, the target would be completely obscured. Bombardiers would spend the entire approach watching their target clearly through the Norden's optics. They'd be tracking the factory, making their calculations, getting everything lined up perfectly. The crosshairs would be centered. The rate calculations would be dialing in. Everything would be working exactly as designed. Then, at the critical moment, right when they needed to make the final adjustments and release their bombs, the target would vanish under a blanket of artificial fog. One bombardier, Lieutenant Robert Chen from the 379th Bomb Group, described the experience in a letter home. "You spend 45 minutes over enemy territory getting shot at, freezing half to death, watching for fighters, and dodging flak. Finally, you reach the target and line everything up. The factory is right there in your sights, clear as day. Then, it's like someone dropped a curtain. Smoke rolls in and suddenly you're staring at nothing but white fog. You know the factory's under there somewhere, but where exactly? So you guess. You drop your bombs at where you think the target should be, and you pray. Most of the time, you pray wrong. Now you're guessing. You're dropping bombs at where you think the target should be, somewhere under that smoke. And the Norden bombsight, for all its sophisticated mechanics and brilliant engineering, couldn't compute best guess. It needed visual confirmation to work, feed it unclear data, and it produced unclear results. Then there was the matter of combat itself. The Norden needed a straight, level bombing run of at least 3 minutes to calculate trajectory properly. The bombardier would take control through the autopilot linkage, and the aircraft would fly straight and steady while the sight gathered data about wind speed, drift angle, and ground speed. 3 minutes of flying straight and level over Germany meant 3 minutes of being a completely predictable target for every flak gun below. German anti-aircraft gunners loved straight-flying bombers. They could calculate trajectory, set their fuses, and fire with confidence that their shells would detonate exactly where the bomber would be. Pilots quickly learned through brutal experience that evasive action kept you alive. Sudden altitude changes, unpredictable turns, anything that made your flight path difficult to predict reduced your chances of being shot down. But all that maneuvering made the Norden completely useless. The device couldn't compensate for sudden jinking and altitude changes. Its calculations assumed steady flight. So bomber crews faced an impossible choice: fly steady and give the Norden a chance to work while German flak guns shredded your formation, or maneuver to survive while your bombs scattered randomly. Most crews chose survival. They'd fly evasive patterns until the last possible moment, then steady up for maybe 30 seconds of straight flight before releasing bombs and immediately resuming evasive action. The Norden got just enough data to make a rough calculation, but nowhere near the 3 minutes it needed for true precision. The accuracy suffered accordingly. That promised pickle barrel precision became a cruel joke. The barrel had become the size of a town. By late 1943, the Army Air Forces faced a crisis that was getting harder to hide. They were losing bombers and crews at unsustainable rates while hitting only a small fraction of their targets. The strategic bombing campaign wasn't collapsing yet, but it was clearly not working as advertised. Something had to change. But nobody knew what. The answer would come from a mistake, from confusion and desperation over Germany's most heavily defended target, And from one navigator who was willing to admit he'd gotten lost and try something completely counterintuitive to compensate. Sometimes the best innovations come not from planning, but from chaos, not from following the book, but from trying anything, absolutely anything that might work better than what you're currently doing. October 14, 1943, would become known as Black Thursday in 8th Air Force history, and for good reason. The second Schweinfurt raid was meant to finally destroy the ball-bearing plants that supplied 40% of Germany's war production. Every planner knew these factories were critical. Take them out, and German tank and aircraft production would grind to a halt within months. The raid was massive. 291 bombers launched from English bases, each loaded with thousands of pounds of high explosives. The target was clear. The importance was undeniable. The need for accuracy was critical. The raid was also a catastrophe. 60 bombers were shot down by German fighters and flak. That's over 20% of the attacking force destroyed in a single mission. 17 more bombers were so heavily damaged they never flew combat again. The human cost was staggering. 600 men killed, wounded, or captured. Entire crews were wiped out. Some bomb groups lost half their aircraft. And the actual bombing results? Mixed at best. Some bombs hit the factories. Many didn't. The ball-bearing plants took damage, but not enough to stop production for more than a few weeks. Given the cost in men and machines, it was hard to call the mission a success. But buried in the post-mission reports was something strange. Something nobody noticed at first because everyone was too focused on the terrible loss rates and the questionable strategic outcome. 1. Bomb group, the 305th, had accidentally approached their initial point from the wrong direction. Instead of the planned north-to-south attack run, they'd come in from the northeast at roughly a 40-degree angle to the target. Their navigator, Captain Robert Williams, had miscalculated a wind correction during the approach. It was an honest mistake, the kind of error that happens when you're flying through combat at high altitude with oxygen deprivation affecting your thinking. By the time the lead pilot realized they were off course, they were already committed to the bombing run. You don't turn a formation of 18 heavy bombers on a dime, especially with German fighters swarming around you. So Williams made a field decision. He told his bombardier, Lieutenant Charles Murphy, to use the Norden bombsight's crosswind correction knobs but to deliberately offset his aiming point to the right of the factory complex. Think about what he was asking. Instead of aiming straight at the target and letting the bombsight calculate wind drift, Murphy was supposed to aim at empty space beside the target and trust that the bombs would drift back into it. It violated every principle they'd been taught, but Williams insisted, and Murphy trusted him. The results were photographed by the strike cameras that every bomber carried to document their bombing accuracy. When analysts reviewed the footage back in England, they saw something remarkable. Most bomb groups that day achieved their typical 8 to 12% hit rate, meaning 8 to 12% of their bombs landed inside the target area while the rest scattered across the countryside. Not great, but normal for 1943 operations. The 305th Bomb Group's bombs had walked directly through the center of the factory complex. 42% of their ordnance struck within the target area. 42%. That was more than 4 times better than everyone else. At first, analysts assumed it was luck. Random chance. One group happened to have better conditions, or their bombardier was exceptionally skilled, or wind patterns happened to align perfectly for them. But Captain Williams insisted it wasn't luck at all. He had the math to prove it, scribbled in his navigator's log during the flight home, and he wanted someone to listen. Captain Robert Williams stood in a briefing room at an English airbase 3 days after the Schweinfurt raid, trying to explain his discovery to a room full of skeptical officers. His hands were still shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the exhaustion that came after combat missions where you watched friends die while your own survival felt like random chance. On the blackboard behind him, he'd drawn diagrams that looked more like geometry homework than military tactics. Triangles, angles, wind vectors. Most of the officers in the room were staring at him like he'd lost his mind. The Norden bombsight has a fundamental design flaw. Williams began, knowing this would make enemies. The Norden was sacred, the billion-dollar miracle device that was supposed to win the war. Calling it flawed was close to heresy. Not in its engineering, he quickly clarified. The mechanical calculations are brilliant. But it has an assumption built into its design that's killing our accuracy at high altitude. He pointed to a diagram on the board showing a bomber approaching a target. The Norden assumes you're flying directly at your target with wind either pushing you along or slowing you down, headwind or tailwind. Its drift correction is designed for that scenario. But at 25,000 feet over Germany, winds are almost never perfectly aligned with your bombing run. They're coming from the side, pushing your entire aircraft sideways through the air. Lieutenant Colonel James Preston, the group operations officer, interrupted. That's why we have crosswind correction built into the Norden. The bombardier adjusts for drift. Yes, sir, Williams agreed. But that correction assumes you're still flying directly at the target and the wind is pushing you off course. It tries to eliminate the drift. What I'm proposing is that we stop fighting the drift and weaponize it instead. The room went silent. Weaponize wind drift? What did that even mean? Williams continued, his voice gaining confidence as he worked through the physics. At 25,000 feet, crosswinds are typically 80 to 100 miles per hour. Sometimes higher. When you release bombs from an aircraft in a crosswind, they inherit your forward velocity and the sideways drift. The bombs fall for roughly 60 seconds before impact. That's a full minute of drift time. He wrote numbers on the blackboard. If you're flying at 180 miles per hour and there's a 90-mile-per-hour crosswind, your forward momentum carries the bombs about 3 miles along your flight path. But that crosswind is also pushing them sideways at 90 miles per hour, which means 1.5 miles of lateral drift. Without correction, you aim at the factory and your bombs land more than a mile away from where you were aiming. Officers were nodding now. This wasn't news. This was the exact problem they'd been struggling with for months. But Williams wasn't finished. What I did over Schweinfurt, accidentally, was approach the target at a 40-degree angle from the west, with wind coming from my left side pushing us toward the target. I told Lieutenant Murphy to identify an offset aiming point, a reference feature that sat exactly where the wind would carry our bombs from. He aimed at a railroad yard about 1.5 miles west of the factory. He tracked that railroad yard through the Norden, set the crosswind drift angle, and released when the sight told him to. Williams paused for effect. The bombs left the aircraft, started falling, and the crosswind pushed them from the railroad yard toward the factory. They arrived at the factory exactly as they hit the ground. 42% accuracy, sir. 4 times better than anyone else that day. The silence in the room now was different. Not skepticism, but the stunned quiet of people realizing they'd just heard something important. You aimed away from the target, Preston said slowly, and let the wind blow your bombs back onto it. Yes, sir. Instead of fighting crosswind drift, we used it as part of the weapon delivery system. The wind did the work of correcting our trajectory. Colonel David Mitchell, who commanded the entire bomb wing, stood up. He'd been quiet throughout Williams' presentation, just listening and thinking. Now he spoke with the careful precision of someone who understood the implications. If this works consistently, if it's not just luck, you're talking about revolutionizing our entire bombing doctrine. Every bombardier in the 8th Air Force would need to be retrained. We'd need new approach procedures for every target in Germany. The tactical manual would need to be completely rewritten. Yes, sir, Williams agreed. But we'd also be tripling our accuracy almost overnight. And that means we'd need 3 times fewer missions to destroy each target, which means 3 times fewer crews lost. Mitchell considered this. The human cost calculation was impossible to ignore. If offset bombing worked as advertised, it would save thousands of lives. I want controlled tests, Mitchell finally said. 3 missions with mixed formations, half using traditional approaches, half using your offset technique. Same targets, same day, so weather conditions are identical. If your method consistently outperforms traditional bombing, we'll take it up the chain. If it doesn't, he didn't need to finish that sentence. If it didn't work, Williams' career would be over. Understood, sir. But I need one thing, What's that, Captain? Permission to train the test bombardiers personally. This technique is counterintuitive. Bombardiers have spent months learning to aim directly at targets. Now I'm asking them to aim at random buildings or fields and trust the math. They need to understand the geometry completely, or they'll freeze up during the actual mission. Mitchell nodded. You have 1 week. Make it work. The mathematics behind offset bombing weren't complicated, but they required bombardiers to completely rewire their understanding of the problem. For months they'd been taught, see the target, track the target, release on the target. The Norden would handle everything else. Offset bombing said, forget the target exists. Focus on the wind triangle and the geometry of drift. Williams set up training sessions that ran from dawn until late evening. He worked with 6 bombardier navigator teams, the best crews from different squadrons. They needed to master the technique quickly because if the test missions failed, the entire concept would be dismissed as one man's lucky mistake. The first lesson was wind measurement. During the bombing approach, navigators would take 2 drift readings at different points on the way to the target, essentially measuring how much the wind was pushing the aircraft off course. By comparing these readings taken a few minutes apart, they could calculate wind speed and direction with surprising accuracy. Good navigators could get wind data within 5 miles per hour of actual conditions. That precision was critical because the entire offset technique depended on knowing exactly how strong the wind was and which direction it was blowing. Next came the geometry. Williams would set up problems on a blackboard. You're flying at 180 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. Wind is 90 miles per hour from the west. Your target is Schweinfurt's factory complex. What's your approach angle and what's your offset reference point? Bombardiers had to calculate the optimal approach angle, usually between 40 and 50 degrees, from the wind direction, and identify a distinctive landmark that sat exactly where their bombs needed to start from for wind to carry them onto the target. The hardest part was psychological. Bombardiers had been trained for months to track their target obsessively through the Norden's optics. The target was everything. Now Williams was asking them to ignore the target during the crucial bombing run, and instead track some random building or road intersection or river bend. It goes against every instinct, Lieutenant Charles Murphy admitted during one training session. Murphy was Williams' bombardier from the Schweinfurt raid, the man who'd actually executed the first successful offset attack. Even knowing it works, even having done it successfully, I still feel wrong aiming at empty space while the factory sits right there in front of me. That's why we're training, Williams replied. We need to make the geometry as instinctive as the old method. By the time you fly the actual mission, calculating offset angles should feel natural. The practice missions over English coastal ranges showed immediate promise. Crews that had struggled to hit targets with traditional methods were suddenly achieving accuracy they'd never thought possible. The bombs would track sideways during their fall, pushed by wind that was no longer fighting them but working with them. After 5 days of intensive training, the test crews were ready. Mitchell scheduled 3 missions to different German targets: an oil refinery, an aircraft factory, and a marshalling yard. Each mission would include formations using traditional bombing approaches and formations using Williams' offset technique. Same targets, same day, photographed with strike cameras so accuracy could be precisely measured. The results weren't even close. Traditional formations achieved their typical 10 to 12% accuracy. Offset formations achieved 38 to 41% accuracy. The improvement was so dramatic that Mitchell immediately ordered the data classified and sent to 8th Air Force Headquarters with a priority flag. Within a week, General James Doolittle, who'd just taken command of the 8th Air Force, was reading Williams' report in his office. Doolittle was famous for his technical expertise. He'd earned a doctorate in aeronautical engineering from MIT before the war and had personally pioneered instrument flying techniques. He understood the physics of Williams' offset method immediately. More importantly, he understood the implications. The 8th Air Force was being bled white by losses while achieving marginal results. If offset bombing could triple accuracy, It would transform the entire strategic bombing campaign. Doolittle made the decision quickly. Every bombardier and navigator in the 8th Air Force would be retrained in offset techniques within 3 months. That meant reaching 12,000 men scattered across 40 airfields in England while simultaneously continuing combat operations. It was an enormous undertaking, but Doolittle gave it absolute priority. January 1944. General Doolittle faced a problem that most organizations would kill to have. He'd discovered something that actually worked, and now he had to implement it across 12,000 airmen in the middle of a war. He handed the impossible task to his operations officer, Brigadier General Frederick Anderson, with a simple directive: retrain every bombardier and navigator in the theater. You have 12 weeks. Anderson's response was reportedly unprintable, but he understood the stakes. Offset bombing represented the first genuine breakthrough in bombing accuracy since the war began. If they could roll it out successfully, the entire strategic bombing campaign could finally start, achieving its objectives. The retraining program started with the lead. Crews, the most experienced bombardiers, and navigators who flew in the front aircraft to formations. These men set the pattern for everyone else. When a lead bombardier released his bombs, 50 other bombardiers would immediately toggle theirs in unison. So lead crews had to master offset techniques first and perfectly. Captain Williams was pulled from combat duty and assigned to travel between bases, conducting intensive training courses. He'd arrive at a base, gather the lead crews, and spend 2 days teaching them the mathematics and geometry of offset bombing. Theory in the classroom in the morning, practice missions over English ranges in the afternoon. The challenge was that England's winter weather made training difficult. Thick cloud cover was constant. Winds were unpredictable. Daylight hours were limited. But in a perverse way, this actually helped. If crews could master offset bombing in English weather conditions, the somewhat better visibility over Germany would be manageable. The practice missions followed a standard pattern. Crews would take off at dawn and fly to bombing ranges off the English coast where old ships and floating targets had been positioned. They'd make offset approach runs, dropping practice bombs, small concrete training weapons that created distinctive splashes when they hit the water. Each crew had to demonstrate at least 3 successful offset runs before being certified for combat operations. Some crews got it immediately. The geometry clicked in their minds and they could calculate offset angles almost instinctively. Other crews needed 10 or more practice runs before achieving consistent accuracy. What made the training effective was that combat veterans were teaching combat veterans. This wasn't some peacetime instructor with a pointer explaining abstract theory. This was Lieutenant Murphy from the 305th Bomb Group, the bombardier who'd executed the first successful offset attack at Schweinfurt, standing in a freezing Quonset hut, showing other bombardiers exactly what he'd done and why it worked when students struggled with the counterintuitive nature of aiming away from targets. Instructors would show strike camera footage from recent missions. Here's traditional bombing on this factory. 9% accuracy. Here's offset bombing on the same factory 2 days later. 41% accuracy. You tell me which technique works. The evidence was impossible to argue with. And for crews who'd been watching their bombs miss targets for months, who'd lost friends for those misses, the promise of actually hitting what they were aiming at was powerful motivation. Simultaneously with training, the 8th Air Force was rewriting its entire tactical doctrine. Field Order 259, issued on February 20, 1944, officially authorized offset bombing approaches for all missions where crosswind conditions exceeded 40 miles per hour. Since crosswinds at bombing altitude almost always exceeded 40 miles per hour, this essentially made offset bombing the new standard procedure. Staff officers worked around the clock creating detailed briefing packages for every major target in Germany. Each package included recommended offset approach angles calculated from historical wind data. Schweinfurt. Approach from the northeast at 45 degrees. The Ruhr Valley complexes, 50-degree offsets from the west. The ball-bearing plants at Stuttgart, 40-degree approaches from the southwest. Someone at headquarters had done truly impressive homework, analyzing years of weather records and calculating the optimal geometry for each target. Group commanders received these packages with instructions that they weren't just recommendations, they were doctrine. The implementation wasn't perfectly smooth. Older pilots who'd survived 1943 sometimes resisted changing tactics they'd literally bled to learn. There's a documented incident from March 1944 where a pilot from the 91st Bomb Group refused to fly an offset approach to Brunswick, insisting on the traditional straight-in attack, because that's how we've always done it. His bombs missed the target by half a mile. That pilot was quietly reassigned to non-combat duties. Doolittle was serious about this: adapt or get out of the way. By April 1944, offset bombing had become standard operating procedure across the 8th Air Force. Mission. Briefings now included dedicated wind analysis, sections where meteorologists provided expected wind speeds and directions at bombing altitude. Navigators received pre-calculated offset approach headings based on forecast winds. If conditions changed en route, navigators had lookup tables that let them recalculate on the fly. The system was becoming systematized, which meant even average crews could achieve results that previously required exceptional skill. The results showed up in the bombing data immediately. In March 1944, the 8th Air Force's average CAP dropped to 1,250 feet, a 60% improvement over December 1943. More importantly, the percentage of bombs hitting within target areas climbed from 11% to 27%. That still meant 3/4 of bombs were missing, but it represented a genuine revolution in capability. German factories that had previously required 4 or 5 raids to seriously damage could now be crippled in 2. The strategic bombing campaign was finally starting to work as advertised. Then came D-Day, and offset bombing faced its ultimate test. June 6, 1944. Dawn over Normandy. The success of the largest amphibious invasion in human history depended, in part, on whether Allied bombers could destroy German coastal fortifications before troops hit the beaches. These weren't just gun positions. These were reinforced concrete bunkers with walls 8 feet thick, housing artillery pieces that could shred landing craft from miles offshore. Intelligence had identified 49 major battery positions along a 50-mile stretch of coastline from Utah Beach to Omaha Beach. Every one of these positions had to be neutralized, or thousands of soldiers would die in the surf before they even reached the sand. The 8th Air Force drew the mission for Utah and Omaha beaches. Enon, they had a window from 5:50 a.m. to 6:30 a.m., 40 minutes to drop over 2,900 tons of bombs on fortifications that covered less than 2 square miles total. The timing was brutal because they'd be bombing in twilight conditions with cloud cover forecast between 3,000 and 6,000 feet. Normal doctrine said you couldn't accurately bomb through clouds, but offset bombing techniques combined with radar navigation made it theoretically possible to hit targets you couldn't even see. The plan was complex. Pathfinder aircraft equipped with H-2X radar would lead each formation. This radar could paint a crude picture of the coastline by detecting the boundary between land and water. Navigators would identify distinctive coastal features, river mouths, peninsulas, distinctive shoreline curves, and use those as offset reference points. The mathematics were identical to visual offset bombing, except now crews were doing it with radar returns instead of optical sighting. Bombardiers would track the radar reference point, calculate the wind drift that would carry bombs from that point to the fortifications, and release. The execution on D-Day morning was chaotic. Cloud cover was worse than forecast. Solid overcast from 2,000 feet up to 10,000 feet in many sectors. Bomber formations had to descend to 12,000 feet to get below the worst weather, putting them well within range of any German flak guns that survived the preliminary naval bombardment. Wind conditions were challenging. 25 to 40 mile per hour crosswinds from the northwest, pushing aircraft toward the beaches. But those same winds became the weapon, just as Williams had discovered over Schweinfurt 8 months earlier. At Omaha Beach, the bombing results were initially reported as catastrophic. Most bombs landed inland, cratering fields and roads behind the German positions. Post-invasion analysis suggested only 31% of fortifications at Omaha took direct hits during the air attack. But at Utah Beach, something very different happened. The bombardiers attacking Utah had used offset approaches exactly as trained, approaching from the northeast at a 45-degree angle with crosswinds pushing them toward the beach. They executed their release points precisely, trusting the mathematics and geometry they'd practiced for months. The bombs walked through the German battery positions in neat lines, collapsing bunkers and destroying gun emplacements with brutal efficiency. Of the 28 major fortifications at Utah Beach, 25 were knocked out before troops landed. That's an 89% effectiveness rate. The difference between Omaha and Utah came down to one critical decision in the bomber crews. At Omaha, bombardiers had added a deliberate safety delay to their release points. They were terrified of hitting their own landing craft, so they held bombs for a few extra seconds. That extra delay meant bombs landed 200 to 300 yards inland from the fortifications. A noble intention, but a catastrophic result. At Utah, bombardiers stuck rigidly to their calculated release points with no safety delays, trusting the mathematics to keep bombs off the beaches. That trust was rewarded. When the 4th Infantry Division hit Utah Beach at 6:30 a.m., they found German positions already destroyed. Resistance was light. Casualties were minimal. The beach was secured quickly, allowing follow-on forces to pour inland and link up with airborne troops who'd dropped overnight. At Omaha Beach, where the bombing had been less effective due to those safety delays, the outcome was dramatically different. German defenders in surviving positions opened devastating fire on landing craft. The beach became a slaughter ground. Casualties were horrific. It took hours of brutal fighting to secure even a small beachhead. The tactical difference between Utah and Omaha was documented in a classified after-action analysis completed in July 1944. Traditional straight-in bombing approaches, even modified for safety concerns, achieved 31% effectiveness at Omaha. Offset approaches executed as trained achieved 89% effectiveness at Utah. That's not a marginal improvement. That's the difference between a technique that barely works and one that decisively wins battles. The report's conclusion was stark. Offset bombing had reduced the number of raids required to neutralize fortified positions by a factor of 3. By summer 1944, offset techniques had become so standard that the term offset bombing started disappearing from official documents. It was just called bombing, now because there was no other way to do it. The technique that Captain Williams had discovered by accident over Schweinfurt had become doctrine so fundamental that, within a year, nobody even questioned it anymore. The desperate innovation born from Black Thursday in 1943 didn't end with World War II. It fundamentally changed how humans think about dropping things from aircraft, and its influence extends into modern warfare in ways that would surprise the crews who invented it. When the war ended, and analysts from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey sat down to evaluate what had actually worked. They found something remarkable in the data. Between January and December 1944, offset bombing became universal across the 8th Air Force. Total tonnage dropped on Germany increased by 340%, while accuracy improved by 190%. You were dropping vastly more bombs and hitting far more targets. That combination broke German industrial production in ways the early war's random bombing never could have achieved. The Cold War transformed offset techniques from tactical necessity into strategic science. When the Air Force started planning nuclear strikes in the 1950s, accuracy became existential. A conventional bomb that misses by a mile just wastes resources. A nuclear weapon that misses by a mile might hit the wrong city entirely. Air Force bombing schools began teaching offset geometry as fundamental doctrine, as essential as learning how to take off and land. Every bomber pilot in Strategic Air Command could calculate offset angles instinctively. because their training assumed they'd be delivering atomic weapons through Soviet air defenses where straight-in approaches meant certain death. The mathematics evolved with technology. When the B-52 Stratofortress entered service in 1955, it carried radar bombing systems that were essentially automated offset calculators. The AN/ASQ-38 bombing navigation system could identify radar reference points, calculate wind drift, determine optimal offset angles, and fly the approach automatically. The bombardier's job shifted from manual calculation to system supervision. But the underlying principle remained unchanged. Identify a reference point that isn't your target. Calculate how wind will carry your weapons from that point to the target, and let physics do the work. Vietnam proved that offset bombing worked in entirely different environments. The monsoon winds over North Vietnam created conditions as challenging as anything over Germany, sometimes worse. Winds at altitude sometimes exceeded 150 miles per hour, creating drift that would carry bombs for miles if not properly calculated. B-52 formations bombing the Ho Chi Minh Trail approached targets at offset angles calculated from real-time wind measurements taken by weather reconnaissance aircraft. Despite dropping from 30,000 feet through winds that would have made accuracy impossible using traditional methods, arc-light missions, the code name for B-52 raids, achieved average CEPs under 1,500 feet. Then, precision-guided munitions arrived and seemingly made offset bombing obsolete. Why calculate complex wind triangles when you could drop a laser-guided bomb that corrected its own flight path? The first Gulf War in 1991 showcased weapons that could fly through ventilation shafts. Military analysts declared the era of calculated bombing over. GPS and computers would handle everything now, except they were wrong, because they'd forgotten about electronic warfare. Modern air defenses don't just shoot at aircraft. They jam GPS signals, spoof targeting systems, and create electronic environments where precision weapons become unguided again. When GPS is jammed or spoofed, you're suddenly back to 1943's fundamental problem. How do you hit a target when your sophisticated technology stops working? The answer modern air forces have rediscovered is offset bombing. Current doctrine for GPS-denied environments teaches bomber crews to use radar-identifiable features as offset reference points, calculate wind drift manually using basic geometry, and deliver weapons using calculations that wouldn't look out of place in Captain Williams' 1943 notebook. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, the most sophisticated aircraft ever built, incorporating technology that seems like science fiction, has offset bombing calculations built into its mission planning software, not as a backup but as a primary option for certain scenarios. When you're penetrating defended airspace where using active targeting systems would compromise stealth, passive offset techniques let you attack without radiating any signals. You identify reference points using synthetic aperture radar, calculate the offset angle that puts wind drift on your side, release weapons, and leave before the enemy knows you were there. Even drone warfare uses offset principles. Reaper and Predator operators dealing with high winds at altitude sometimes use offset aiming points for Hellfire missile attacks. The missile's guidance system handles the final approach, but the initial firing solution uses offset geometry to put the weapon in the ballpark while conserving fuel. The technique has come full circle to where it started. Desperation breeding innovation. Modern military planners preparing for potential conflicts with peer adversaries assume GPS will be jammed or unavailable. Training crews on manual offset bombing with an intensity not seen since 1944. Flight schools are teaching wind triangles again. Bombing ranges are running offset approach practices. Someone in the Pentagon apparently read the after-action reports from D-Day and realized that when high-tech solutions fail, low-tech geometry still works. Robert Williams and Charles Murphy probably never imagined their navigation error would influence warfare 80 years later. But that's how genuine innovation works. It solves the immediate problem so elegantly that it becomes permanent, woven into doctrine so fundamentally that future generations don't even question it. The physics haven't changed. Wind still pushes falling objects sideways. Geometry still describes how angles and distances relate. And sometimes the best way to hit your target is still to aim at something else and trust the math. Offset bombing wasn't just a World War II innovation. It was a fundamental insight into how to weaponize environmental forces instead of fighting them. Every precision strike happening anywhere in the world today, whether GPS-guided or manually calculated, owes something to that confused October morning over Schweinfurt when one navigator got lost, made a mistake, and accidentally discovered that the shortest path to your target isn't always a straight line. Sometimes you need to aim sideways, trust the wind, and let physics do the work. In 1943, that counterintuitive insight saved thousands of lives and helped win a war. In 2024, it's still saving lives and still winning battles because good ideas don't have expiration dates. They just keep working, quietly, in the background, long after everyone's forgotten why they started working in the first place. And that, ultimately, is the best kind of innovation, the kind that becomes so obviously correct that people can't imagine ever doing it differently. Captain Williams' navigation error turned into geometry. Geometry turned into doctrine. Doctrine turned into victory. And victory turned into a permanent change in how humans wage war from the air. All because someone had the courage to admit he'd gotten lost, the creativity to try something completely counterintuitive, and the mathematical skill to prove it wasn't luck but physics. Sometimes the best way forward is sideways. That was true in 1943. It's still true today, and it'll probably still be true 100 years from now, when pilots flying aircraft we can't even imagine will still be calculating offset angles and using wind as a weapon. Just like Lieutenant Murphy did over Germany on that terrible October day when aiming at the wrong target turned out to be exactly right.